Hello, government class. All right, today we're going to talk about federalism. Now, we've talked a lot already, or you've learned already, about putting together the Constitution, the branches of government, although we're going to talk about those more in depth in upcoming lessons. But at least you've learned how branches of government are separated, of separate powers, different roles for each branches. The Constitution, obviously, through the Bill of Rights and through many of the later amendments, list out individual rights and liberties. But a lot of the things in the Constitution were not necessarily brand new or unique ideas to the Founding Fathers when they wrote the Constitution. You'd already had the English Bill of Rights is about 100 years older than our Constitution. It sets forth some of these concepts that we have, even going all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, certain rights were set forth. And then you had certain philosophers, John Locke being one of the primary ones that our Founding Fathers looked to, but also Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. People like this who'd been writing in Europe on some of these ideas that we ended up in our Constitution. But this idea of federalism, all right, it was one that was pretty unique. It was more of one of the more unique inventions that our Constitution uses, and that's what we're going to talk about and explain today. All right, so what is it? Get rid of that. All right, so what is federalism? Well, it's a system of government where governmental power is shared between different levels of government. That's what it is in a very broad system. All right, when different government levels are sharing power. How it works in the United States, though, is of course through the states themselves. Power is shared between the federal government, and that's also known as the national or central government, and the state governments. All right, so before we go on and talk about that, let's make sure we understand these terms. When you hear someone talk about the federal government, that is our country's national government. That's the government, the capital in Washington, D.C., President, Supreme Court, Congress with its 535 members. That's the government that's over the whole nation. All right, so many countries that would be called the national government or the central government. Typically here we refer to it as the federal government, which can be kind of confusing because federalism itself is a system where you're sharing power between different levels of government. So the fact that we use the word federal to then refer to one of those levels of governments that's sharing power can sometimes be confusing, I believe, to students. But just understand there is a little bit of distinction. When you're talking about federalism, you're talking about the system where the national and the state government share power. As we'll see here, sometimes the federal government has power to do something, sometimes the state governments have power to do something else, and sometimes they share them. All right, but understand those terms. Federalism is a system of government, but when we talk about the, quote, federal government, we're talking about that national government, okay? All right, so, and I think perhaps one reason students have trouble with federalism is it's hard to really get a mental picture of how it's working. All right, so I use this map there, and as you see, that's the National Capitol building. That's the federal capitol. Now, it's based in Washington, D.C., but right here, the creators of this map put it in the center. All right, and as you can kind of see, the states kind of have a shadow, all right, over them, because the national government somewhat sits over and covers all of the states. Now, as we're going to learn, there are some things that only state governments can do, but by and large, the federal government is there to govern the whole country, all right, all of those states. Whereas each of the states have their own capital, like here in Texas, it's Austin. Each of the states have their own capital to govern themselves within the limits of that particular state. So that's why I think sometimes it can be hard for students to understand because it is a unique system where, if we're sitting here in Dallas, Texas, yeah, we have to follow the federal government's rules, but there are also state laws we have to follow. There are city or county laws we have to follow, and sometimes it can be confusing which government has control over what aspect of the law or an issue. All right, so let's talk about the background. Why do we have the system that we have? Well, and it goes back to history. All right, when America declared its independence, remember they were fighting against a king and a parliament, or a legislature based in London, that was exerting influence over these 13 colonies an ocean away. And all of the power, or at least much of the power, was located in London, in England, and it wasn't in the 13 colonies. And the 13 colonies didn't like that. Throughout a lot of the colonial history, they had some form of self-government. But when Parliament and the King starts chipping away at that self-government in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s, colonies become upset. They say, you know what, this isn't fair that we're being governed by some centralized government, some king and parliament an ocean away. We liked it better when we were governing ourselves. And so when they won independence, each of those states basically acted as if they were their own country. They worked together to fight the war, but they really, when the war broke out, and certainly before the Revolutionary War, they didn't really view themselves as all being in one country. Okay, Massachusetts would have considered themselves British. They would have considered themselves from Massachusetts as their country, but they wouldn't have necessarily considered themselves in the same quote-unquote country as South Carolina. All right, they all recognized that they were all part of the same British Empire and that they were all colonies in the British Empire, but they really didn't see themselves as unified. So when they declare independence and win the war, each of those 13 states is really bent on governing itself. They were governing themselves for the most part. They weren't asking the other states' permissions of what laws to pass and what laws not to pass within their states. And if you're a leader of one of these states, you kind of like that because no one can challenge your authority. You're in charge. So they were very loath, by that I mean reluctant, to give up this power, give up this supreme power that they had that no one could tell them within their state what to do. So, but the problem is that system wasn't working very well. And so the states ended up sending delegates to Philadelphia in 1787 to try to amend what was the Constitution at the time, the Articles of Confederation. But the people who got there, and I'm talking about George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, people like that, when they got to Philadelphia, they realized that amending the Articles wasn't going to be good enough. They were going to have to start from scratch. So their challenge was, how do they create a system where the national government has enough power that it can actually get something done? Because under the Articles of Confederation, it really couldn't get anything done. How do they create a system where the federal government has enough power to get things done without taking away so much power from the states that the states would refuse to ratify it? Okay, because ultimately, it was 50-something men in a room one summer drafting this Constitution. But the only way the Constitution was going to be followed and go into effect is if the states themselves ended up ratifying it. So they come up with this federal system that we have, that we still use today. Now, there's been lots of changes in how it operates over the last 240, 230 years. But it's the same basic system where, okay, yes, the federal government has certain powers. It has enough power that can operate certainly. But the states still to this day maintain some of their traditional powers. All right, so let's talk about what powers the Constitution gives. Because the Constitution is mainly said on the federal government. It was creating a federal government. All right, so what powers does it give to the federal government? And we're going to talk about them here in the next couple slides. But the word we use here is delegates. It's a fancy social studies word for gives. The Constitution delegates certain powers to the federal government. And some of these delegated powers are specifically expressed. We call them expressed powers. All right. That means they are very explicitly or specifically written. The federal government can coin money. It can levy taxes. It can declare war. Those words themselves are in the Constitution. And so no one really doubts whether the federal government has the power to do that or not. The Constitution specifically says it does. But many other powers, all right, and you could probably argue that most of the laws that end up getting written fall within these implied powers. All right, and that's what the name for powers that are delegated to the federal government but aren't specifically written down, such as creating an air force. All right, the Constitution says the government can create an army and a navy, but when the Constitution was written, we were still more than 100 years away from the invention of airplanes. They didn't know what an air force was. But because the Constitution so explicitly gives the federal government the power to maintain a military, once that military includes an air force, it's basically implied that, of course, the federal government has this power. All right, and we'll talk about some of these more as we go. But understand the difference between express powers and implied powers. There's not too much arguing necessarily over express powers, but a lot of the political fights we have in this country since the Constitution was written and continuing up until today, and my guess will be continuing through 100 years from now, is over the implied powers. Can the federal government do this? And for someone who thinks we should have a very limited, smaller federal government and that the power should remain with the states, then they think these implied powers are very narrow. All right, they're very reluctant to find an quote-unquote implied power within the Constitution. However, for those people who believe in a little more dynamic and powerful federal government, they're much more willing to find an implied power within the Constitution. All right, and so this fundamental, how you view the Constitution, how you view the federal government's role, is what drives a lot of the political debates that we have today. Okay, so what are some of the federal government's express powers? One, the federal government regulates foreign and interstate commerce. All right, interstate commerce is commerce between the states, so business being conducted between the states. And this is probably what has changed more over the last 230 years than anything else that we're going to be talking about in federalism. There may be a couple other big changes, but this is really one of the biggest. Because, if you go back into the 1790 or 1800, sure, there was certainly commerce between the states, but not like there is today. You didn't have FedEx shipping packages all over the country on a daily basis. You didn't have a national highway system in which 18-wheelers were going to all 50 states every day. You didn't have a train track system where you had tracks laid in all 50 states. Well, you don't have train tracks going to Hawaii, obviously, and it's probably not directly to Alaska either. But you have ships going to Hawaii and Alaska more frequently. So because we are able to move goods so much more now, it's really brought a lot more things into this purview of interstate commerce. Because what the Interstate Commerce Clause says is the federal government can regulate business being done between the states. Now, in 1800, it was much less. Someone may live and work, may have been born on a farm and live on that farm their entire lives and never get more than about 20 miles away from that farm. They may make a lot of their own clothing, they grow their own food, they may even make some of their own basic tools. build their own houses, that sort of thing. So they don't need a lot of goods from other states. Now, certainly, at times they would, order goods from another state or go to the general store and buy some goods that were shipped in from another state or something. So there was interstate commerce back then, but it was much less. But now, very few items that you or I are ever going to buy was manufactured 100% from scratch, in the state where we live. Now, Texas has manufacturing plants, of course, but some of the parts, some of the gear they use that are in these manufacturing plants were almost certainly coming from other states or other countries. So the fact that commerce between other states and between other countries is so interwoven in everything we buy and do now, it's given the federal government a lot more ability to regulate things now that they wouldn't have been able to regulate, say, 200 years ago under the Commerce Clause. So understand the importance of this Commerce Clause. All right, next, and I'm not going to list out every single express power that the Constitution gives the federal government. We're just going to talk about some of the highlights. All right, the Constitution expressly says the federal government can raise an army and a navy. It can declare war, and the reason for this is obvious. It really wouldn't be effective if certain states declared war against a foreign country and other states didn't. All right, we can't have, we have 50 different states now. You can't have, say, 22 of them deciding to go to war with the country and 28 of them not going to war. War is on a national scale. Either our whole nation's going to go to war or it's not. So this is why this is an express power for the federal government. Coin money. Right? So if you have, and I know we mostly use debit cards and credit cards nowadays, but some people still use cash. So if you have a $5 bill there in your pocket, that bill is worth $5 in Texas or New York or Illinois or California or wherever you go. There's a reason that these 50 states don't have 50 different currencies. All right, we all use the exact same currency on a national level, and that's because the federal. Excuse me. Let me strike that. Started that sentence over. That is because the reason we do not have 50 different currencies is because the Constitution expressly gives the federal government the power to coin money. Again, the federal government can create a post office, can make treaties with foreign government. This is sort of the same idea that we're talking about when we're talking about declaring war. It wouldn't work if Texas, say, had a treaty with, say, Mexico, and California had with different rules, different agreements. That can never work. So all of our treaties are made at the foreign level. All right. So if we have a treaty, we're either all going to be in it together or we're all not going to be in it. Okay. So the old treaty was known as NAFTA, which has since been updated. Between America, Canada, and Mexico. That's a trade agreement that's been in place for about 25 years, although, again, it has been recently amended, given a slightly different name, but this is still what people think of. That's for the whole country. All right. That deal involving trade with Canada and Mexico, the same rules apply if you're in Iowa as if you're in Florida or New Mexico or wherever you happen to be, because that's made at the federal level. And finally, levy and collect taxes. All right, April 15th, that's the big day. Everyone in the country has to file their federal income tax returns on April 15th, and that's when your taxes are due. All right, so the federal government is specifically allowed to levy and collect taxes. Okay, so those are the express powers. Again, people don't tend to argue about these very much because they're specifically written down. No one argues that the federal government doesn't have the power to raise an army or to create a post office. The Constitution very clearly says it does. But what about implied powers? And where these implied powers comes from, basically comes from what's called the necessary and proper clause. All right, so there on the right of your screen, you'll see I've quoted part of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, subsection 18. And it says Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution of the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. All right, so if you see that, that's Article 1. Now, as you remember from your earlier lessons, that's the one that created the legislative branch. Article 1, Section 8, subsection 18. Now, if you go to Section 8, Article 1, Section 8, the 17 clauses that come before this one are all basically listing out what powers the legislative branch has. What can Congress do? I.e., declaring war, coining money, regulating interstate commerce. All those things we listed on the previous slide. Those are typically, for the most part, listed in 1 through 17 of Section 8, Article 1. But once you get all the express clauses, express powers listed, then the founders of the Constitution, or the framers of the Constitution, added a number 18 here, which then gave Congress the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. Okay. So, again, the necessary and proper clause gives Congress the power to make all laws that are necessary and proper. Make sure you kind of understand that terminology and words, because there's going to be some fighting and wrangling over what these words mean. The necessary and proper clause is also known as the elastic clause. Think about elastic. Think about an elastic waistband or something. All right, so you have sweatpants and elastic waistband. Here in about a month, 6 weeks, we'll have Thanksgiving. The more and more you eat, you need that elastic to stretch more and more, right? All right, so the bigger your waistline gets, you need more and more elastic to stretch. Well, that's what's happened over the last 230 years to the federal government. All right? It was very, very small back when George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were president. Incredibly small. Now it's incredibly large. All right, so for the last 230 years, as the federal government, basically waistline, so to speak, has grown and grown and grown, the elastic, this necessary and proper clause, has had to stretch and stretch, right? To give the federal government the power it uses now in a much more large country, in a much more complex, at least economically speaking, technologically speaking, we're much more complex now. And so the federal government has stretched its powers to that elastic clause. But as I mentioned on an earlier slide, this clause is one of the most debated clauses in the Constitution. Because the very fact that we're talking about implied powers, it's not clear, it's not specific whether things are allowed or not. All right, people like Thomas Jefferson argued that the word necessary really meant essential. All right, basically, Jefferson's argument is if an act isn't absolutely essential, in other words, it can't be done, or something can't be achieved without a power being implied, then that power should not be implied. Okay? So, Jefferson argued necessary meant essential. But people like Alexander Hamilton, and ultimately, and probably most importantly, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall, believed that the clause allowed the federal government to pass laws that helped or enabled to carry out its enumerated powers. Okay, not that necessarily that a power was essential for the government to continue existing, but that it enabled the government to carry out one of those specifically enumerated powers, like levying taxes, coining money, regulating commerce, that sort of thing. Now, ultimately, Hamilton and Marshall's view wins this debate, although certainly there are plenty of people today who are not convinced that they should have won the debate. But in key court case after key court case, when John Marshall was on the court, certainly the federal government's view, this elastic power that it's gaining, wins the arguments. And the fact of the matter is, over the last 200 years, the federal government's powers have been growing, stretching more and more. Again, plenty of people do not agree with this. They don't like this fact. But it's hard to argue that our federal government isn't bigger now and exerts its power now more than it did 200 years ago. All right, so what are some of these implied powers? One, establishing a national bank. All right, this was really the first big test of what necessary and proper meant. This is really where the parameters of necessary and proper were first set forth in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. All right, the federal government had created a national bank. They had done that going way back to the beginning of Washington's administration, but people are still fighting about it, 20 years later. And I had a Supreme Court case on it that we'll study in more detail later. But the bottom line is, John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, wrote the opinion, and it set forth that yes, in fact, the federal government does have the power, an implied power, but the power to establish a national bank. And if you think about all those other powers we mentioned, coining money, levying taxes, regulating commerce, it's not that big of a stretch to see. It's like, well, okay, if you're going to be handling this much money, having a national bank would certainly enable or help you do that. But now Jefferson and people like him had argued, well, it may help, but is it absolutely essential? Can you levy taxes without creating a national bank? And they'd have argued, yeah, you can. It may be more difficult, but you can collect taxes and then just go deposit them in state banks. But ultimately, the Supreme Court, under John Marshall's leadership, found that the government did, in fact, have the power to create a national bank. Other implied powers are creating an air force. We talked about that earlier. Exploring space. Obviously, when the Constitution was written in 1787, launching rockets and spaceships into orbit wasn't really on the Founding Fathers' minds. Outlawing certain drugs. All right, nothing in the Constitution gives Congress the power to make certain drugs illegal, but certainly through the ability to regulate interstate commerce, they have created many drug laws over the years. And finally, things like creating national parks. Again, we have many, many national parks in the country, but yet nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that the federal government can set aside land to create a national park to be used by the citizens. Okay, let's stop there. We've gone a little under an hour and a half. So let's stop there. So we set out the federal government's powers, both express and implied. Next time, we're going to talk about powers relegated specifically for the states, what are called concurrent or shared powers, and then we'll talk about some more concepts of federalism.